was a lot more than what he played. He was more sophisticated culturally. He liked to go antiquing. He would he would buy clothes for people because he'd been a costumer. He'd done every job on a film set. He propped. He'd done costumes. He'd stunted. He'd done everything you can possibly do on a film set. And he had this little weird knack. He could look at somebody and know exactly what size clothes they wore. So he would say, well, he's a 42 long. Go buy him a 42 long sport coat. Probably a plaid. He'd look good in a plaid. He was politically conservative. He'd been politically conservative since college. He felt, though, that he was a true liberal in the sense that he liked to hear what other people had to say. He didn't have a knee-jerk attitude about A plus B equals C, that he wanted to hear what other people's opinions were. Wayne loved the process of making movies because he'd done every job before he became an actor. He'd done props, he'd done costumes, he did stunts, he did, as I mentioned, he did all these basically blue-collar jobs that you can do on a movie set. So he understood everybody's position in the filmmaking food chain, and everybody's necessary. He wasn't one of these actors who thinks everything comes from them, and the grip and the guy up in the lights running the lights are irrelevant. He understood that you can't make a movie without those people because he'd done that job. And he knew how hard it is to work, especially on a low-budget picture, which is where he earned his matriculated in his younger days, because he couldn't get an A-list picture to save his life. The first marriage failed because he was a very young man, and he was a kid in the candy store, and he did not necessarily observe his marital vows. And he regretted the failure of that first marriage a great deal, because he always thought she was the finest woman he'd ever met. And he'd blown the marriage, and he knew he'd blown the marriage. And he cleaned up his act in later years and didn't mess around. But he still had that basic emotional predisposition to be a workaholic. And when his last wife would suggest, why don't you quit? Why don't you spend more time? We could go on the boat. We can do this. We can travel. I mean, she might as well have been asking him to slash his wrists. I mean, he would never have willingly stopped making movies if his health hadn't broken down in the last couple of years. Partly it's because old Hollywood, quote unquote, the truth really wasn't out there at the time. The truth was buried. You had the fan magazines, you had Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, but the fan magazines were totally controlled by the studio. The personalities that were presented through the scrim of publicity. So I think what I'm doing is retroactively trying to go back and write the books that should have been written in 1935 or 1945 or 1955, but weren't being written at that point. And it's harder because there aren't that many people left alive anymore. But every time I start out to do a book, I think, am I going to find anybody? And I always find 60 or 70 or 80 people to talk to. People live a long time nowadays.